Most content that gets created doesn't get seen by enough people, not because it's bad content, but because the team spent so much time creating it and not enough time distributing it. This isn't a content quality problem, it's a strategy problem. And repurposing is the answer. You can repurpose your content for different channels and in different formats and to cover different stages of the customer journey over a period of time. And that's what this episode is all about. You're listening to the Content 10x podcast, where it's all about content repurposing. I'm Amy Woods, and I'm here to help you maximize your content and find smart ways to get your message in front of more of the right people, whilst also saving time. Let's get started. Hello and welcome to the Content 10x podcast. I'm your host, Amy Woods, and welcome to part 6 of our content strategy series if you've been following along. If you haven't, then do go check it out. So over the past 5 episodes, we've been looking at building your content strategy from the ground up, looking at what a strategy is, audience analysis, competitor analysis, linking to business goals. We've looked at channels and formats and messaging and positioning. And now we're looking at how to make your content strategy sustainable. We're leaning into my favourite topic, which is content repurposing and distribution. Now, I know that most marketing teams, they don't have an unlimited budget and unlimited resources. So this episode about repurposing and distribution, we're going to be looking at how to do more with less within those real world constraints of any busy B2B marketing team. In case you missed any of the previous episodes, then go check out the links in the show notes where you can catch them all. They're all on the Content 10x podcast on all the podcast apps and also on our YouTube channel on our website as well. And then the final part of the content strategy series is all about measurement and KPIs. So working out if your content strategy is actually doing its job and delivering results. So as I said, repurposing and distribution, this is one of my favourite topics to cover. At Content 10x, we have always been about repurposing and distribution. We're a B2B content agency, the first agency I believe to ever exist that focuses specifically on content repurposing, started back in 2017. And then in 2019, I published a book about content repurposing, the first book to ever been written in the content marketing world about content repurposing and distribution. Of course, we have this podcast as well, 350 plus episodes about making your content go further. Sometimes we deviate into different aspects of B2B content marketing, but always at the heart of the Content 10x podcast, we're looking at maximization of content and smart ways to do that. So as I mentioned, I'm really excited to dig into the topic of this episode. It's definitely something that I and Content 10x know an awful lot about. Now, in the last episode on the Content 10x podcast in this content strategy series, we talked about content channels and formats and making sure that you choose the right ones. So this topic links very nicely into that. Because once you know what platforms you're going to focus on and the formats that you're going to lean into, that really then does form your repurposing roadmap. Because that then means that you're not going to be repurposing randomly, but you're going to be feeding specific content into specific channels that you know works for your audience. So basically, the content strategy informs the repurposing plan, and the repurposing plan makes the channel strategy executable. Because without repurposing, showing up on multiple platforms is very challenging for B2B marketing teams, as I said, with limited time and limited resources. So repurposing helps you to do that. And then I'd also like to link to messaging as well. So positioning and messaging that we've covered in this content strategy series too, because repurposing helps you to be consistent with your messaging as well. If you are sticking to your messaging framework in core content, and then you repurpose that content, it helps you to stay consistent with that messaging. But before I jump into the main content for this episode, just to mention our B2B content operations benchmark. It's a free self-assessment. It shouldn't take any more than 4 minutes of your time. You get asked a series of quick-fire questions, and then from that, you get a personalized report. It covers content strategy, it covers your team, capability and culture, and also your tech and operations as well. A personalized report, it's not generic, and it will give you some important resources, some actionable advice and insights as well, based on where you are and where you want to be. So just head to content10x.com/benchmark and go take our B2B content operations benchmark assessment. So the big important question, what is content repurposing? Now, content repurposing can be defined in many different ways. The way I define content repurposing, it's finding creative ways to communicate your message in different formats and in different locations so that you can reach and connect with your audience. And I think connect is a really important word there. Yes, we do want to reach our audience, but we want to connect because it's only through connection that you help your audience to think, feel, or do something differently. And then when we look at the intent of our content, if we can connect with people, then we're more likely to match that intent and then get the outcome that we would like from that content. So we want to reach, but we want to connect and resonate with our audience, and content repurposing helps us to do that. It's certainly not about copy and paste. It's not about having one size fits all across lots of different platforms. It's platform specific. And it's also not about checkbox marketing either, just having a certain type of content and then ticking some checkboxes as you repurpose it in one standard way every time. It's a lot more than that. It's a strategic approach. And when I speak to B2B marketers, I never ever get any pushback when I talk about how effective content repurposing and focusing on distribution is. I think we all know that doing more with our content and helping it go further, maximizing the ROI, is a really important thing to do. But just quite often it can get deprioritized or forgotten about, which is why I believe that we must put that at the heart of our content strategy. And building on from that, so why is content repurposing important? Well, firstly, it can help you to be focused on your content and your core topics. So if you are focused on your topics and you know that you have a repurposing process, a repurposing engine in place, it can really help you to stay focused, knowing that that content is then going to be able to fuel other channels with platform-specific content. And on that, it can help you to expand your reach, of course, so it can help you to show up on those different platforms, getting in front of more people. It can also help your ability to connect with your audience as well. Some people connect differently with different types of content. Some of us are more readers, some of us are more watchers, some people prefer only bite-sized content, some people really love to dig into long-form content. So if we are repurposing content in different formats and different styles, it just means that it gives us a greater chance of connecting with a broader section of our audience that have different preferences over different content types. We've also talked in this content series about messaging and positioning. It can really help you to stay on track with your core messaging and your positioning as well. If you're repurposing content that was really aligned with your core messaging, then the repurposed content will be as well, which will prevent you from having a scattergun approach to your messaging on different platforms. And in turn, all of this is going to help you gain more trust and more authority. And there's also the efficiency gains as well. So if we're looking at smart ways to do more with less, then ultimately we can lean into being more effective with the time and resources that we have, and we can create more content or more quality content, more meaningful content with the same time and resources, but by directing our efforts in more smarter and more efficient ways. Another key benefit of why we would repurpose content is because it can help us with search as well, through traditional SEO and also Gen AI search, because again, we are being aligned with our messaging. We are saying the same things consistently, just in different ways, which always is going to help us with search. And we can make sure that we're repurposing content in ways that is suitable, for example, for Gen AI. So repurposing long form into shorter snippets and that kind of thing. It's going to help you get found by search, whether that's traditional or Gen AI search. And another important point that I really like to make when putting forward the business case for repurposing is you give people an opportunity to spend more time with you. And when people spend more time with you, they become more aware of what you're all about, and ultimately they start to trust you more. In episode 210 on the Content 10x podcast, I shared an episode all about the zero moment of truth. And this is about spending time with your audience where they will require over 7 hours of time in your company through your content across 11 different touch points and 4 different locations. So, for example, 4 different platforms, 4 different channels. And ultimately, that will build up to them feeling like they know you and trust you enough to hopefully make a positive decision when you're asking them to take action. So check that out, the zero moment of truth. But through really effective repurposing, one piece of content can be repurposed to cover those 11 different touch points, the 7 hours and the 4 different platforms. Now, I would definitely say that often in B2B, especially in complex industries, it's going to be more than 11 touch points as well. There's loads of different studies that cover this. Sometimes you'll read that it's 20 touch points or whatever it may be. We know that there are many different touch points that we need to have to gain that trust with our B2B audience. Now, what does it take to repurpose content? Yes, there are systems and there are processes and there are tools to help us with our repurposing, but I would very much argue that it is also a mindset. And often what it takes to repurpose content is a mindset shift. Many B2B content marketing teams, they will be spending 80 to 90% of time on the creation of content, but maybe only 10 to 20% of time on the actual distribution of that content. And that actually needs to shift. It almost needs to go the other way around. We need way more time on the distribution and repurposing than the actual creation itself if we're going to embrace the doing more with less philosophy. Otherwise, what you'll find is you'll be investing all of your time and resources into the creation of the content, but then not enough people actually get to see that content. And that would be such a shame. So I would argue that that equation needs to flip. You need to be spending 60 to 70% of your time making sure that your content is going out on the right platforms in exactly the right formats and reaching your audience. You're going to find that your investment of time and resource goes further if you spend that crucial time on the distribution of the content. Now, I know this can feel counterintuitive because creating that core content, it feels so productive. But knowing that the distribution is where the value is going to come from, that's why I believe it takes a little bit of a mindset shift. And this means that when you are planning content, so when you are planning that big report or that white paper or that podcast series or the event, be it in person or virtual, but when you are planning that content, you need to plan the repurposing at the same time. Repurposing and distribution, it should never be an afterthought. Now, this is a catchphrase of mine that I've had for almost a decade now. Don't make it an afterthought. You need to be thinking about your repurposing and distribution when you are planning the core content to begin with, because if you know how you will repurpose and distribute the content, it's going to affect how you create it in the first place, which will make it more repurposable and more easy to distribute. And then you will get the maximum return on investment from all of the effort that goes into that content. If you're going to put lots of time and effort into something and you're discovering, okay, I'm not going to be able to do a lot of repurposing and there aren't many distribution opportunities from this, take that as a sign that maybe you need to follow another approach and follow an approach that is going to bring more repurposing opportunities. Now, this episode is part of our content strategy series, so I'm not going to go into the finer details of what constitutes a repurposing plan, but let's just look at this from a content strategy perspective. So when you are developing your content strategy, and I've been talking about putting repurposing and distribution at the heart of your strategy. So what could that actually look like? From a strategy development perspective, it could look like embedding some repurposing principles in the decisions that you make over content. For example, always conducting that repurposing assessment on a piece of content before you decide whether you're going to go forward with it. That could be a core part of your content strategy. And then perhaps adding on to that, you will only invest in content if it has a certain repurposing potential. You could embed into your content strategy some key principles about how you will then go and plan content with repurposing in mind and the approach that you will take to do that. And perhaps you'll develop some high level ways in which certain content types will be repurposed. So when we embark upon webinars, this is the general approach to webinar repurposing that we will follow. When we approach a report or white paper, this is the general approach that we'll always follow to repurposing that type of content. And this is the assessment that we will make to see whether we should forge ahead with that, with repurposing in mind and maximizing the value of that content. I mentioned this already, but the question, when should you plan your repurposing? It is when you are planning the core content to begin with. So don't create anything without thinking about that repurposing. It will really help you to create content that does repurpose better. And what I mean by that is, for example, if you are creating some storytelling content, you can think about the different way that you can share the story that is going to break down into platform-specific content once you repurpose it. Or perhaps you need to create your content in certain segments and make sure that you share complete thoughts in clear segments through your content so that you can then go and repurpose the bigger piece of content into those individual segments. It's a bit like planning your content into chapters, so to speak, which will make it more repurposable. And I actually think it will make it easier to consume as well. So it will make for a better piece of content as a core piece of content, as well as a better piece of content for repurposing as well. Now, what would be an example of this? What would be an example of repurposing a core B2B piece of content? Well, let's look at webinars. So webinars are a really popular form of content in B2B marketing. What could you repurpose a webinar into? So you could plan your webinar and you could be repurposing that into, for example, a YouTube video. You could be repurposing that into a podcast. So we've worked with clients who do regular webinars and then we will edit and produce that webinar into a podcast episode for their podcast if they have one. You may be then repurposing it into a blog post. So maybe a thought leadership blog post about the particular topic covered in the webinar. And then you'll be looking at your other channels as well. So for example, let's say LinkedIn, where you may plan to create a certain number of image carousels and video snippets. So you will go and create your webinar and you'll plan your webinar knowing what you are going to repurpose into and then build that into the plan. And as well as the social media repurposing, there is another opportunity that we often see, which is actually repurposing this already long form content into longer form content. So taking, for example, a year's worth of webinars and then repurposing the content within that into a report or an ebook or a longer, bigger piece of content. So think about the different formats, think about long form to short form, think about long form to other types of long form content, and also think about long form to even longer form content as well. If you want to find out more about repurposing webinars, then you must head to our blog. We have a great post called The Ultimate Guide to Planning, Promoting and Repurposing B2B Webinars. There will be a link in the show notes. And we also have our B2B webinar planning playbook as well. Again, the link will be in the show notes. And that is a fantastic resource to help you get the most out of any webinar that you plan for. And also do head to our case studies page. We have a fantastic case study on webinar repurposing with our client Bamboo HR. So go check that out as well. Now, once you've repurposed your content, how do you make sure that it reaches the right audience? So how do you distribute that repurposed content? Because the two come together. It is repurposing and it is also the distribution of the content. This distribution is all about making very deliberate decisions about where you are publishing your content and when and how, so that you can get in front of your audience. And good distribution, it starts with knowing exactly where your audience are and the types of content that they expect on that platform. And we covered all of this in the last episode on channels and formats. And it's certainly not about just posting once and moving on. It's about different formats and different channels over a period of time. So when we loop back to the example of webinar repurposing, the last thing that we'd want is to just have some promotional content leading up to the webinar and LinkedIn. And then the webinar goes live and we send out the replay, maybe 1 or 2 LinkedIn posts, and that's it. We want to have content from that webinar that is going out over time. We'll have the promotional content and maybe post-promotional content about an on-demand version. But then let's take out the stories and the thoughts and the insights and have an evergreen plan as well for different formats and different channels, just sharing those evergreen insights. And that could also be content within your website and content in your email newsletter and so on. So looking at your owned and borrowed channels and having a plan for all of that. And a good thing about distribution is also looking at who can help you, not just the platforms and the formats, but who else as well. Your team, your leadership, if you run, say, a webinar again and you have guests that attend that webinar, could you involve your guests in the distribution of the content? So it's not just a how, but it's also a who can help with the distribution of your content and your messaging. And of course, this also means that you'll want to be tracking what's working. And we have a whole episode coming up on the Content 10X podcast, our next episode of this strategy series, which is all about measurement and KPIs and knowing what's working and what's not working. And I feel it's really appropriate here, though, just to mention that I've often heard people be a little bit down on repurposing. They'll talk about how it can cause you to be quite repetitive because they think it's just posting the same thing again and again. And also about cut and paste, just cutting and pasting from one place to another. Now, I would argue that that isn't repurposing. It's certainly not what I consider to be repurposing. It really should be strategic. It's not checkbox marketing. It's not cut and paste. It still needs to be platform specific and aligned to your audience and the formats that work. You're simply looking at how you can communicate messages in different styles and formats to suit different audiences, and always making sure that you align with your business goals, which is part of your content strategy. I think AI has genuinely changed what's possible for repurposing, and that this is a really exciting development for content teams. So tasks that used to take hours, like pulling out quotes from pieces of content and turning transcripts into blog posts and finding engaging video snippets, all those things that used to take hours can take minutes now with really good and effective AI tools. But it's really important that AI doesn't replace the strategic thinking that goes into content repurposing. Obviously, through this episode, I've been really emphasizing that repurposing should be a strategic process. So we don't want AI to replace the thinking that goes on. Because AI doesn't know your audience as well as you. It doesn't know what they want to see on the platforms. It doesn't know your positioning and your messaging and what's going on in your industry like you do. And we don't want to lose that if we outsource all of the repurposing, specifically the decision making, to AI. So my belief is it can accelerate the process for sure, but the strategic thinking still needs to come from the team. So the teams I see using AI really well in this area have a really clear strategy, and they're using AI tools in certain places within their approach in order to help them execute upon that strategy, and not the teams that are using AI to generate lots of random content at volume with no real strategy or direction behind it. Great, so we are almost at the end of our content strategy series. In the next episode, I've mentioned already, we're looking at measurement and KPI. So how do we know that all of this is working? I hope you found this episode on content repurposing and distribution really helpful. As I mentioned, this is what we do at Content 10X, and we have loads of content on repurposing and distribution. You can go and check our free resources on the Content 10X website, and you'll find lots of downloadable guides on repurposing webinars and expert interviews and keynote talks. There's lots of information about repurposing, and we have hundreds of blog posts as well and hundreds of podcast episodes. So head on over to content10x.com and go to our blog, podcast and resources, and there'll be lots to help you with the repurposing and distribution side of things. And if you want help with your content strategy, or with your repurposing and distribution, just get in touch with us. Go to content10x.com/inquiry, and we would love to speak with you. And finally, just a last mention of our B2B content operations benchmark. So if you want to know how you compare to others and want to know any tips and advice specific to you and where you're at, with your strategy or your tech and operations or your team, tools and capability, then do go to content10x.com/benchmark and take our free self-assessment. It'll take no more than 4 minutes and you'll get a fantastic personalised report to help you on your way. All right, well, thank you so much for listening to this episode, and I'll catch you in the next one.